Good morning.
Good morning,
Hi, Lisa. How are you?
Baruch Hashem. How are you?
Baruch Hashem. How was Pesach?
It's nice, it's quiet.
Oh, that's good. And how are you feeling?
I'm not used to Pesach without small children. I need to begin again at my Seder. Time for the older kids to get busy, I think.
Yeah. How are
How-
you feeling?
I'm doing okay, thank you.
That's
I'm
good.
doing, yeah.
Hi,
Hi,
Sarah.
how are you?
Thank God. I don't have it till next week.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought it was
That's
this.
okay.
Okay.
Totally fine. I got a few more days of reprieve. We like that. How are you, Tana?
Baruch Hashem. Good. How are
And
you?
how was your Pesach,
Who
Hannah?
who who are you talking to? Lisa
Please
or Hi,
talk to
Sarah?
me, so you.
My Pesach was good. Thank God. This year was really beautiful. It was more manageable than last year. Last year, I think I lost my mind.
Oh, really? Did you have all your kids home?
No, so not all of them. I had one family plus my single son who studies overseas. So we were able to give like more attention to the ones that came, you know what I'm saying? Instead of like everyone like just yeah.
Cool.
And Baruch Hashem, and my help didn't quit on me before Pesach, so that was good,
Makes a big difference.
which is what happened last year. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Hi, Mira.
Hi.
Okay, so I think that I'm going to start in one moment. Let me just mute all the participants. Okay, hi, Shalavet. Good morning.
How are you?
Good. Could you mute yourself? Because I'm going to start now the recording. I was wondering when not everyone muted. Mute all. 1 second. Yes. Okay. Oh yeah. Okay, good. Okay, fantastic. Okay, chapter 8. We've had a bit of a long reprieve from studying Tanya, but now we're back at it, right? And of course, perfect timing because this is the time of the year that we refine ourselves. And what better way to refine ourselves than through studying Tanya? So this chapter, chapter 8, is actually a continuation of chapter 7. It is in a way a parentheses that the Alter Rebbe puts in while talking about the structure of the souls. The Alter Rebbe takes a couple of chapters to explain the concept of klipas noiga. You see, because it's very easy for us human beings to understand the concept of black and white, right? Like we understand good, evil, holy, unholy, right? So we tend to think in terms of some things are good, some things are bad, some things are holy, some things are unholy. But here the Alter Rebbe introduces us to the concept, actually in the previous chapter already, especially connected with the Jew, because our animal soul comes from this level, the concept of klipas noiga, which klipas noiga is a klipa, yes. So anything that's a klipa conceals godliness because that's a shell, right? It's a protective layering that originally served to protect the world from the negative forces outside of the world. Now, after the sin of Adam and Chava, all these like the shell cracked and everything went into the world. So there's these like pockets of concealment, and there are quite a lot of these pockets of concealment, obviously, in our world. But klipas noiga is a kind of a klipa that is a bridge between holiness and unholiness. And the Alter Rebbe explained that being that it is a bridge, it means that it is kind of like parav, meaning that it could become holy or it could become unholy. And we explained in chapter 7 that how does that work out? that works depending on the intention of a person. So, for example, in chapter 7, the Alter Rebbe gave the example of eating, right? Eating is a permissible activity. There's no mitzvah, right? Except that, of course, we have the mitzvah to take care of our bodies, etc. But very often one eats not to satisfy one's godly soul, but most often we eat to satisfy our desires, our animal soul. And whilst eating is a permissible activity, it can very easily descend into the unholy sphere, which is klipa, or we have the opportunity by using our intention to actually elevate the food we eat and the body that we use to consume that food by having a different intention, that of serving Hashem. So that is in a nutshell, that's what we spoke about in chapter 7. This chapter, chapter 8, is now going to elaborate on Klipas Noiga, but it is going to elaborate on Klipas Noiga in a way that makes it extremely practical. The Alter Rebbe is actually going to give us 3 examples of activities that are either permissible or that are permissible actually, but that can be taken, can be either elevated or can descend into the world of utter klipa, utter concealment of God, can actually descend into the world of not permissible. And we spoke about in chapter 7 also about the concept of tshuva, how when you take a permissible activity and you downgrade that permissible activity, it is easier to do tshuva than any forbidden activity. So, for example, if a person eats kosher food, but not necessarily for the sake of serving Hashem, or he eats it in a gluttonous manner, it is much easier to do tshuva and redeem the sparks of godliness in that food, as opposed to if a person eats a non-permissible food, even with the intention of serving Hashem. And this is how the Alter Rebbe actually starts off chapter 8, telling us that if something descends into the level of the 3 impure klippas, right? So there's 3 categories. There's holiness, there's klippas noiga, and then there's 3 unholy klippas, which is total concealment of Hashem. It's still easier to do tshuva, in other words, to extract them from that level if it was a permissible activity or permissible foods in the case of eating. But tshuva really serves to elevate the person, not necessarily the forbidden object. So, for example, if a person did eat non-kosher food but did tshuva on that sincerely, he has elevated himself, but he has not elevated the food that he consumed, because that food is always going to be forbidden. We can't change a forbidden food into something permissible. Whereas if you ate a permissible food, but not for the sake of heaven, not for the sake of serving Hashem, and yes, because of that, it descended to the same level as forbidden foods. When you actually do tshuva, you then not only elevate yourself, but you also elevated the food. So therefore, and this, by the way, is the first example, practical example that the Alter Rebbe uses in this chapter, that of eating. And I remember years and years and years ago when I was teaching this chapter in Brazil, someone came to the class and she was like, oh my goodness, I thought I was coming to a class about spirituality and all we're talking about is food. So this goes to show you how spiritual food can actually be. So therefore, just to recap, even if the energy from forbidden food was used to study Torah and to do mitzvahs, right? The vitality is imprisoned still in the Sitra Achra, whereas by permitted foods, the vitality, the highest of the food, can ascend when you do tshuva. Now, the Alter Rebbe explains an interesting concept in this chapter, that of the Jewish Yetzer Hara and the non-Jewish Yetzer Hara. Interesting, very, very interesting concept. Because here's the thing. We have explained the concept of Kedusha, Klipa, and Klipas Noiga. We know that there is a godly soul and an animal soul. And the Alter Rebbe has previously explained that the animal soul of a Jew is from Klipas Noiga. It is true that there are individuals amongst the non-Jews whose souls, animal souls, because they don't have a godly soul, animal souls do come from Klipas Noiga, and that is why they are ultimately able to do lots of good in the world, sometimes more than even a Jew, right? But we're talking about potential, right? A Jew has potential to access his godly soul, right? But the nations of the world are intrinsically connected not with Klipas Noiga, but their source is really Klipa on the whole, as opposed to individuals. A Jewish animal soul comes from Klipas Noiga. That is why it is actually against the nature of a Jew to do forbidden things. However, lots of us do forbidden things. We sin, right? But here the Alter Rebbe introduces the concept that it is against our nature, right? Our nature, and remember that our personalities, our characteristics, our nature comes from our animal soul, not from our godly soul, right? So it is foreign to a Jew's character to desire things that are not permissible. The problem, however, is that when we take our animal soul, which is derived from a mixture of good and bad, from Klipas Noiga, and we do permissible activities, but not for the sake of serving Hashem, we open the door, so to speak, to descend even further. We open the door for worse. In other words, that's how we come to sin. We don't just wake up one morning and say, oh, today's a lovely day to sin. It starts off, Sahara is very tricky. It starts off with you doing permissible activities, not for the sake of serving Hashem, which drags these permissible activities down to a lower level than your actual soul. Because your animal soul comes from Klipas Noiga. By doing a permissible activity in a non-permissible way, in other words, in a non-holy way, eating gluttonously. And we're going to speak about speaking forbidden things to be spoken about and studying forbidden subjects. Those are the next two examples the Alter Rebbe speaks about. In a moment, I will explain. We actually take our soul, which is bound up and originates from Klipas Noiga, and we drag it down to the level of pure Klipa, which is not in our nature and is very foreign to our character. And by the way, in the same way, when we do a mitzvah, we take our soul and we elevate our soul higher than itself. And when we do permissible activities for the sake of serving Hashem, we take our animal Klipas Noiga soul and we elevate it to holiness, to Kedusha, which is amazing. We can take our mundane activities and just by having a different intention, by living intentionally for the sake of serving Hashem, we thereby elevate our souls and elevate our whole selves. But again, it is not within the nature of a Jew to desire to sin, and therefore, how do we sin? It starts off with the permissible activities that we do, but not to serve Hashem, and that opens the door for more. It's doing permissible activities in a selfish manner and not for Hashem. Now, in the case of food, right, the Alter Rebbe will discuss three examples in this chapter. Number one, food. Number two, speech, because remember that speech, there is forbidden speech, which is Lashon Hara and the like. There is speech that is holy, which is learning Torah. And then there is permissible speech. We're allowed to speak, right? And then we will discuss what is considered to be called idle speech, speech that has no purpose. Okay, that's the second category we will examine. And the third category is intellectual pursuits or study. We will get there. It's really fascinating, this chapter. So in the case of food, let's just discuss the aspect of food. Interestingly enough, even after a person does tshuva for either eating prohibited foods or for eating food, permitted food, but not for the sake of serving Hashem, Since food becomes part of us and becomes part of our blood and flesh and bodies, there is a vestige that remains, right? So this did discuss in chapter 7 how powerful tshuva is, that tshuva can transform the past. In the case of food, however, since there is a vestige that remains because it becomes part and parcel of your body, the body, therefore, after a person passes away, goes through a certain cleansing that is called chibut hakever. It is a cleansing of the body after a person passes away. And this is true actually not only of food, but for any derived pleasure for the sake of pleasure in this world. And the person did not do tshuva, then after the person passes away, there is a certain cleansing. A person can read this chapter of Tanya and get a little bit like horrified because the Alter Rebbe does mention certain cleansing or punishments. We know that punishment is for the benefit of the soul, the benefit of the body. That does happen after a person passes away. But we don't dwell on it. It is basically the reason that the Alter Rebbe brings around about this awareness for us is to avoid this totally. In other words, don't sin, don't go there, and then you won't have to worry about all that, right? Interestingly enough, he also mentions certain cleansing that come as a result of speech. So now let's speak about talking a little bit, okay? Now we know that there is prohibited speech, which is lashon hara, right? This is a sin for which a person has to do tshuva, and we know that lashon hara, speech, is something that reveals, right? Hashem created the world with speech. He revealed certain things in creation. When we speak about a person, whether good or bad, we actually reveal certain qualities, which is why we really have to concentrate on speaking only good, and we help a person by speaking good about a person because we reveal those qualities. We praise Hashem daily in davening to reveal those qualities in Hashem. But nonetheless, a person engages in speech which is prohibited. For example, lashon hara. Tshuva can be done, right? And can make a person regain his nature, because speaking things which are prohibited, again, doing anything that is prohibited, is against the nature of a Jew, right? But if tshuva was not done, for example, then the soul has to also go through a cleansing after it passes away. And the cleansing is called kaf hakela. It is the slinging of the neshama from one side of the world to another side of the world. There is also something called a Gehenna of fire, a purgatory of fire. And the reason that I am bringing this, not to scare anyone over here, well, firstly, because the Alter Rebbe talks about it, so that's on him, the Alter Rebbe's shoulders, right? But one who engages in prohibited talk, that is a sin that is you are actively doing. It's not a sin of omission, it's a sin of commission. You commit a sin. Therefore, since you are involved in it, your soul has to go through a cleansing of purgatory of fire. But what about idle talk? Because we really try to avoid lashon hara, right? If we have this awareness that is prohibited, we really try our hardest. Sometimes we fail, but we try our hardest to avoid lashon hara, let's say. But idle talk is a category of talk that has no purpose. It's just air, and it comes from the element of air. It's just air. If a person does not do tshuva, in other words, this is a permissible activity without a purpose, definitely not for the purpose of serving Hashem. If a person speaks idle talk without any purpose and does not do tshuva for that idle talk, because let's remember that when a person wastes his time by speaking idle talk, he is not being actively engaged in the study of Torah, for example, or doing mitzvahs. He's wasting his time, right? The Gehenna, or the purgatory or cleansing that the neshama has to go through after the person goes away, is actually called a Gehenna shel sheleg, a purgatory of snow, because you didn't involve, like, you didn't derive like massive pleasure from speaking something prohibited. It was just purposeless speaking. It was like empty talk. So therefore, this purgatory is cold and refers to the sins of omission. So that's just something interesting that the Alter Rebbe mentions. But the Alter Rebbe then goes into, what about studying? What about involving your mental capacity, your brain? Because truthfully, both Lashon Hara, prohibited talk, and idle talk, which is speech that has no purpose, does not really involve the intellect, but involves the emotional part of our souls. It involves our midos, characteristics. When you're speaking badly about another person, you're thinking badly about another person. It's your emotions, right? But when you study non-Jewish intellectual pursuits, which is called Chachmas Ha'umos, intellect of the nations of the world, right? Any study which is not Torah, right? We're not talking about prohibited studying, right? But if you study subjects with no purpose, because the Alter Rebbe does mention that if you have a purpose in studying, for example, to have a parnasa, that is a purpose, to sustain your family, to be able to serve Hashem, that is a purpose. But you're studying without any purpose in mind, just, for pure interest, or just because you want to, just for no purpose whatsoever. Alter Rebbe says that idle speech is not as bad as studying non-Jewish intellects, because idle speech affects the midos, whereas this affects your intellect of your soul. Now let's remind us something. When you speak idle speech, your intellect remains untainted and uninvolved, actually. You're not really using your brain because it's idle, no purpose, air, right? But when we actually involve our intellect in prohibited or purposeless intellectual pursuits, you are tainting a part of the neshama that is more refined and therefore more difficult to extract from the complicated descent into Klippa, right? Because just like eating without a purpose can be destructive, so too studying without a purpose, the Alter Rebbe says, can be destructive, and even more so because the use of the mind in senseless activity is more sensitive. Isn't this incredible? Right? So let's just go back to food for a moment. The nefesh elokis, the divine soul, can be affected by the sins a person does. Right? We always say the divine soul is divine and cannot be affected, and it's godly and nothing can change it. It's true, but there are layers and levels, and the nefesh elokis can be affected by the sins a person does because it's in your body. It's imprisoned in your body, your godly soul, right? However, when you overcome the impulses of your animal soul, you achieve the opposite, which is to elevate the body, right? But if the midos, the emotions of the animal soul, are tainted, what is the result of this? It affects our ability to feel godly emotions. It affects our ability to feel love and fear of Hashem, which is the godly emotions. This is if the emotions of a person are tainted, right? But intellectual pursuits not in accordance with the Torah, right, can be even worse because we now have tainted our intellect. So we have mentioned there is a concept of the godly light of the godly soul not affecting the emotions, right? And that is a concept called Timtum Halev, which we will discuss further. The plugging of the soul. That is when the intellect of your godly soul does not influence and affect the emotions of your animal soul, which is what it's meant to do, right? And there are different solutions for that. But here, we are not even letting the intellect think divine thoughts. We are, by pursuing forbidden intellectual pursuits, by studying aimlessly Chachmas Hagoyim, or intellectual pursuits of the nations of the world without a purpose, we are going a step backwards. We are not only not influencing the heart, but now we have tainted the mind. Because let us remember that according to Tanya, and according to what the Alter Rebbe teaches us, we cannot control the emotions of the heart, but we can control the mind, right? In the case where the mind cannot control the heart, that's a different problem. That's a problem called Timtum Halev, which, by the way, can result of eating as a result of, can occur as a result of eating prohibited foods. That's a different story. But in the case of intellectual pursuits, which is forbidden or not for the sake of heaven, we are even corrupting the mind. So we have no chance of influencing the heart if we've corrupted the mind. So it affects our emotions to even a greater degree. That is why the Alter Rebbe mentions it here, and he says it's not Timtum Halev that we're talking about, but it is called Timtum Hamayach. So the corruption of the intellect, of the mind. So just to recap, right? And in the next chapter, the Alter Rebbe goes back to discussing the structure of the souls, etc. Just to recap that, yes, tshuva is always possible. We can always do tshuva. Obviously, it's easier to do tshuva for activities which are permissible, but that we did not do for the sake of serving Hashem. Much easier to do tshuva for that than for prohibited activities. But even so, tshuva is always permissible. For the effects that we have not on the body and the soul that we have not taken care of as a result of tshuva in this world, after the soul passes away, it goes through various cleansings in order to regain the holiness lost as a result of those activities. And the three examples that the Alter Rebbe mentions in this chapter are, again, that of food, which he had started in the last chapter, which obviously when we eat permissible food and we have the intention to serve Hashem, we elevate that food to a level of holiness. When we eat permissible food, but gluttonously or not for the sake of serving Hashem for our own pleasure, we downgrade it to a level of unholiness, but it is easier to do tshuva. Speech also has a prohibited component and a permissible component, and the prohibited component, or idle speech not for the sake of heaven, taints our emotions. And then the Alter Rebbe brings the example of intellectual pursuits, which, if they are prohibited intellectual pursuits or intellectual pursuits without purpose, not for the sake of serving Hashem, they can also be downgraded, and not only do they taint the emotions, but they also taint the mind, which is more delicate. But of course, tshuva is always possible for all of these categories. And that is this chapter in a nutshell. Any questions?
Hi. What about when people criticize themselves? Is that is like they say, "Oh, I'm such a nebuch," or
Love the question, Shalamis.
or like sometimes
Yes.
people work so hard learning Hebrew and they're breaking their head, they're trying all possible methods, and it just doesn't go in. And it turns like you know.
Yes, self-judgment is also not a good thing. Self-judgment, I think we discussed even last week about anxiety, but self-judgment also falls into the category of prohibited thoughts. You see, at this level, it's thoughts. I mean, unless you talk to yourself all day and say, "Oh, you're such a klutz, you don't know how to do anything," that could happen as well, right? But yes, prohibited thoughts are, we do sin in thought, speech, and action. So this is a very, very good question, and prohibited thoughts, these are not permissible thoughts, and they do affect our emotional ability to love and fear Hashem. They will prevent you. They come from the nefesh habahamis, and it goes back to what we always say. The involuntary part of the emotion, right? Of, like, let's say you're like frustrated with yourself, or you're angry at yourself, or you're disappointed in yourself. And I'm saying yourself because your question referred to what about, things we tell ourselves, right? If they keep you from serving Hashem, then they come from the Yetzer Hara and Nefesh Abamis. If they are in a tiny dose that is like very motivating for you to become better, which is normally not the case, then maybe we can say they come from the divine soul. But generally, if they are constant, right? They're not like at a specific time. I'm thinking about my faults and I want to rectify them. I'm curious about why I feel the way. If they're almost constant and involuntary, yes, we have to actually change those thoughts. And
So what
thereby
would be the
produce
first
different
step,
emotions.
if you gave advice to a person, what would be the first step?
So the first step is awareness. The first step is awareness, to become aware of what you're telling yourself. That is the first step.
Okay.
Then you would become aware of what emotion that chatter is producing. The third step would be, okay, what emotion do I want to produce? And then ask yourself, what are the thoughts you need to have in order to produce the godly emotion? Healthy emotion, godly emotion, in order to serve Hashem. Because you see, when we produce these thoughts that are frustrating and sad and angry, that prevents us from serving Hashem. So that's really the question you have to ask yourself. Is this helping me serve Hashem or hindering me?
Right.
Go ahead, Chayzara.
So I have to say this class is a bit of a downer.
Oh no, by the way, before you even say this, I will say that this chapter is one of the most musardika chapters in Tanya.
Okay, fine. Okay. I'll tell you, because as a Bas Tuva, I know that after 120 years, my body's going to really be bounced around a lot from just merely the food that I ate before, because there's nothing you can do about that. It's part of your blood system, you said. And that's that. So,
Okay, have I ever told the story of a woman in Brazil that stopped coming to my classes because of this chapter?
yes.
She's still a part of my classes. Don't worry.
Okay.
I actually, I'll give a tiny, with your permission, can I just tell this before you go on? Okay, so probably around 10 years ago, there was someone who was coming to my classes in Brazil who got very upset for the exact same reason that you just said. She said, I now keep kosher. What does that mean? Like, I've done Shuvah. What do you mean? Like, it's part of my blood and I just can't do anything about it. And she stopped coming to my classes and she had never missed a class. So I actually called up Rabbi Majeski. I don't know if any of you have heard him. He runs Machon Yadus in Crown Heights. And I sometimes call him for advice about Tanya. And I was like, this is what the Alter Rebbe says. I mean, so he said that he had a student in his class, in his school, like 40 years ago, must be 50 years ago by now, who had the same question. It's a very common question, and it's very disappointing. 1 second, what do you mean? It's part of my blood, right? And he encouraged this woman to write to the Rebbe, and the Rebbe said that the Rebbe's answer, and he said he doesn't know where the letter is. He lost track of the letter, but the content, the gist of what the Rebbe told her was that, first of all, we know that there are two types of tshuva, right? There's tshuva from fear, tshuva from love. That gets discussed much further along in Tanya. But there's a level of tshuva that a person does because they're scared of punishment, right? Which is not the point of this chapter. We do not want to do tshuva because, oh my goodness, I don't want my body to be whatever, go through all this purgatory and whatever. That's not the point. Because the ideal is really to do tshuva as a result of loving Hashem, right? We actually discussed this last chapter that the awareness of your sin is so great, and you realize that, oh my goodness, I'm so far from Hashem, that the actual sin is an incentive for you to become closer to Hashem, and that's tshuva me'ava. It's tshuva from love, but tshuva from love is a very, very high level. On the other hand, tshuva that comes as a result of love is transformative, right? It's what transforms our previous sins into merits. But here we're all of a sudden, I'm just making the question like more succinct, like, 1 second, I did tshuva, I felt like I can't not keep kosher anymore, I want to come closer to Hashem, and now you're telling me it did not completely transform the past, because it remains in my blood, right? And the Rebbe answered with an answer that could only come from the Rebbe, really amazing. And the Rebbe said that today, nowadays, we're on a lower level. Tshuva me'ahava, which is a positive occurrence resulting from something negative, right? You did a sin, you realize how much you love Hashem, so you want to come closer to Him. Tshuva me'ahava is achieved today as a result of teaching and influencing other people. In other words, you can take the negative that occurred to you in your youth, you didn't eat kosher food, you can thereby influence other people, whether it's your children, whether it's a mitzayim, whether it's speaking to relatives, whether it's speaking to friends about keeping kosher. And through doing that, you actually do achieve a complete transformation, and it does not remain in your body.
That's nice.
Yeah, so it's actually easier today to do that. So any negative, so Rabbi Majeski at the time told me, tell her to go on Mitzayim. So she wasn't really the type that was about to go on Mitzayim, but I explained to her she's influencing her children to eat kosher, and that's taking her negative occurrence and using it to become positive.
Okay, so that was just going to be my this is the question I have, is that so sometimes we do really fluffy things, they're not really even intellectual pursuits, but we'll get like caught off on different tangents just to give our brains a rest or whatever. And we can rationalize that, I'm just watching, 10 stupid Instagram things and learning about like really crazy 20 uses of foil. But it's like, I don't know why that even popped into my head. But anyway, but you know what I'm saying? And I can rationalize that and say it's in order to be able to be more like open to learning Torah or whatever it is, like, or do you know what I'm saying? So like, or idle talk, getting together with a girlfriend and just blabbing and just having fun and nothing, but it's all for a purpose.
Okay, so here's the difference. The difference is if it happens by default or it happens with intention. So if you get together with girlfriend, whatever, have a blast and just blab about nothing on earth, but you have an intention beforehand that you're doing this because you need socialization and you need to be a healthy person, and this is all in order to serve Hashem, you've elevated that encounter. And that is not anymore considered idle talk. Right? Obviously, the ideal is that we should talk, subjects of Torah, but no, we're not on that level. So, yes, there are times that I get together with friends to just talk about nothing on earth because I need to get together with friends in order to be a healthy person to serve Hashem. Right? Let's take the big challenge of this generation, which is mindless scrolling. Right? So that can be, yes, idle, serve no purpose. So there are two aspects to this. Number one, if you just need some brainless time because your brain is on overload, like I know, for example, I'm involved a lot in mental pursuits because I give a lot of classes and I'm involved in a lot of preparing, and sometimes my brain just needs a break, right? So if you decide in advance that you need a break, you're not going to be for 5 hours now scrolling about, foil and whatever it is. But how much time do I need? Half an hour, whatever it is. It all boils down to intention. That's beforehand. Afterwards, after the fact, you could also ask yourself, okay, now that I involved myself in this brainless activity, how do I feel? Is my energy restored? Is my energy boosted? Is my energy depleted? I don't know about you, but most often me, if I go off on a tangent and I get lost and, in the worldwide, whatever, Instagram, Facebook, whatever, mindless scrolling, I don't feel good afterwards. I don't feel like my energy was restored. Sometimes we convince ourselves that it's going to restore our energy, but really doesn't. So it all boils down to awareness again, right? So if you become aware of how that affects you, and you know what? If you scroll for half an hour and you feel like, wow, I'm doing amazingly, well, then that's great. That's a good activity for you to do, right? Sometimes a person needs to eat an ice cream, However, 10 ice cream cones might not be a good idea. Does that help you, Sarah? One second, Sina.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So it all boils down to intention, what it does for your energy, how it affects you, and also I think it's like look, let's not fool ourselves, right? We sometimes tend to do that.
I like when you say intention versus default.
Oh yeah.
I think
That's
it's
my
really
that's my big
important
thing,
to
folks.
default.
It's all
Yeah.
about living life with intention, living life by design instead of living life by default. Go ahead, Sina.
Hi, everybody. Hi, Sarah, I really appreciate that you mentioned that because it was totally on my mind, everything that you said, but I'm so jet lagged I can't even think. But sometimes I just wanted to say that I'm so happy that you said this, Hannah, about the intention. And when things get too much on me, I like to go to I say to myself, but I'm going to be more careful about the time. I have to watch things that just make me laugh my head off. I have to have that release of that energy of all that COVID, of all that heaviness, on me, and just looking reel after reel after reel, and the algorithm knows that you want to see more funny things, right? And I have to now I see that that's okay, because afterwards I feel like, oh, okay, that was good. Just like having you didn't have someone to talk to have a good laugh, but you got it from Instagram. But the intention. So I really appreciate, Zara, that you brought that up. And thank you, Hannah, for clarifying that for us. And yes, now the whole chapter doesn't seem so depressing anymore. It seems a little bit more manageable. Like, thank you.
The whole awareness that the Altar brings about is not for us to become down. That's not the purpose. The purpose is for us to just because when we have an awareness, then we have true choice, right? If we're not aware of what goes on, the choice is not real, right? If a person scrolls even these funny videos, right? And Sina, you mentioned time factor, right? If a person laughs for half an hour, that's great, because it just lifts your mood but what if you sat there for 5 hours? First of all, you'd stop laughing, you'd get a little numbed out, and it wouldn't even, serve a purpose, right? And that's the thing. But the awareness, going back to Shalam's question, what's the starting point of everything is awareness, because awareness is a precursor to choice. When you're aware of what's going on, then you have a real choice. If you're just not aware of what you're doing while you're scrolling for 5 hours, then you don't even have a choice. You're like imprisoned. Okay, anyone else?
Yeah, I have just to add, and hi, Sarah, asked my question in a different way. I was wondering, I sit with my family at night and we laugh and laugh, like we catch up on our day and we laugh. Is that considered?
No, that's wonderful.
It,
That's absolutely wonderful. As long as the laughing does not, people, we have to serve Hashem b'simcha. The laughing, there's something there's a concept called leitzonus, which is like laughing, which is mocking, which is senseless. Laughing together with your family is not senseless. It's creating emotional bonds. It's making you lighter, happier to serve Hashem. That's wonderful. That's not senseless.
Yeah, we're not laughing at other people.
Exactly. So that's the awareness that has, if people start laughing and then it veers into laughing at other people, as you said, or mocking, then that's a problem, right?
So I think the only way to sort of get through this chapter without feeling down or scared, for me, as you were talking, I just kept reminding myself what you said at the beginning, because when you first started speaking, I thought, oh, this is an inspiring chapter. Because really, what you're reminding us and teaching us is that it's really just one small step.
Exactly.
One small
Exactly.
elevate
Yeah.
from mundane to holy, right? So at the beginning I thought, oh, this is going to be a great chapter. It's just reminding me it's one small step. And then it's like, oh no, you're going to burn in purgatory. It's like, ah. So I think the only way to study this chapter is just to keep that in our head at the beginning. That
Right,
it's
but I do want to mention this whole burning and purgatory, etc., etc. Imagine you had the most beautiful item of clothing, silk, you got it from who knows where, designer, da 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 da, and it got a stain, right? And the only way to get that stain out is to really scrub the stain.
Mhm.
That is what all of this is all about. There's absolutely no, there's no purpose of. It's not meant to scare us. It's not meant to keep us stuck. It's just a way of preserving the beauty of our godly soul. That's all it is.
Mhm.
Like personally, I know that some people do get scared of, oh my goodness, my soul, this and that. I'm like, oh, I'm relieved that exists. That solution exists. Because imagine it wouldn't,
Mhm.
right? And also in Judaism, let's remember that all these punishments or cleansing are not permanent. That's why the Kaddish prayer is only said for a maximum of 11 months, because after that it's done. The soul is holy and ascends level by level, etc.
But I have a question also about how to do tshuva when we fail in these ways. Like if
Okay,
I
so that's for a different discussion. That's actually discussed in Igeres HaTshuva, the third chapter. But we could discuss that, but I think it's not really directly directed to this chapter. But how to do tshuva is a huge topic, huge.
um,
But
okay,
the basics of tshuva is what the Rambam says in the laws of tshuva. The basics of tshuva is regret, admitting your fault, and making a different decision for the future. In other words, if you are faced with the same situation and you act differently, then you've done tshuva.
okay, that's
If a person ate non-kosher food, made a decision to eat kosher food, and now is tempted by non-kosher food, but still eats kosher food, he has done tshuva,
me.
right? If a certain situation angers you and you lash out at a person and you do tshuva on that, and the next time the same situation comes around, you're not tempted to lash out, then you've done tshuva.
Beautiful. Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. Thank you.
Okay. Anyone else before we wrap up?
Thank you so much for a wonderful class.
Thank you, Hannah.
Take care, everybody. See
Thank
you
you.
next week. Emes Hashem.
Have a good week, everyone.
And Chodesh Tov to everybody. Happy Rosh Chodesh.
Good news.